Okay. Welcome everyone to Journeys to the Books of the Prophets. With God's help, we are going to finish the second book of Shmuel tonight. We have a lot to learn here, but I would really like to finish the book tonight. And as promised, next week, at least 1 week, then we're going to go back and see the bigger picture of King David. We've been just following the events through the book of Shmuel. We haven't really looked at the full picture of who David was, where his soul was coming from, and especially his influence on Jewish history. That is for next week, but we have to get through the end of the book. So here we go. So we're starting at the end of chapter 21. That's where we ended last week, is that David is now fighting a series of wars. They're not explained in great detail, but there were a number of battles with the police team, the Philistines. But here it says something, and it says that David became very weary. So now this is a big, big change. This is towards the end of David's life. We're in the last year of his kingship, the 40th year that he ruled, 7 in Hebron, 33 in Jerusalem. And here, David, who is the great warrior who conquered enemy after enemy, here it says he became very weary. And his top people in the army said, you need to kind of go to the back lines because we need to protect you. It's like we see that you're not on the same level that you were before, that you could fight as when you were young. And that's how chapter 21 ends. Chapter 22 begins basically the entire chapter begins Vayedaber David laHashem et divrei hashira azot b'yom hitzil Hashem oto mikav kol oivav u'mikav Shaul. That David spoke to God. In other words, he wrote a song to God, and the words of this song he wrote on the day that Hashem saved him from all of his enemies and from Shaul. So this is David. The book of Psalms is 150 Psalms. Many people don't know this, but it's obvious from reading the Psalms that David did not write all of the 150 Psalms. He is the main writer, the main compiler, but according to the tractate in Baba Batra, there are actually 10 contributors to the 150 Psalms. We're not going to go into that right now, but this song is repeated almost word for word in Psalm 18. Psalm 18 is virtually the same as chapter 22 of Shmuel Bet. And what's important about this song is, and it says clearly that he wrote the words of this song. This is one of the 10 archetypal songs sung through creation, through all of history. There are 10 archetypal songs. 9 of them have already been sung, and the 10th is waiting for Mashiach. And it's called Shirul Hashem Shir Chadash, that they will sing a new song to God when Mashiach comes. Again, our purpose is not to go through the 10 songs right now, but some of them are the Song of the Sea, Ha'azinu, Devorah's song, Hannah's song, the Song of Songs, and this is one of them. So this song, it takes up the entire chapter 22. It's a fairly long song. We're going to just go into what I'll call the highlights. Now, first of all, it says that this is a song that he wrote on the day that God had delivered him from all of his enemies. So there's different commentaries. Some say remember, this is in his 40th year of ruling. He's really towards the end of his life. And some say this song only came quite literally after he was delivered from all of his enemies. Others say that the song was in stages of development, we'll put it that way. Because here it goes back to Shaul. Well, that's 40 years ago. So some say that he only like put it together in his last year, but he was in a certain way composing it the whole way through. As I said, it's a fairly long song. So I'm just going to pick out some of the highlights here. One of the highlights is right in the beginning, in the third verse. It says, Migini v'keren yishi, that God is my shield and the horn of my salvation. In this chapter, he mentions the idea of God being his shield 3 different times. In a few other Psalms, he also mentions the same thing. And so this is very, very connected to the whole concept of Magen David. You see behind me a picture of the Magen David, which is literally the shield of David. Many call it the Star of David, but it literally means the shield. And that's how he uses it in this song 3 different times. I just introduced the first time, but 2 other times he goes through and mentions that God is his shield. This is not the time to go into the whole history of the Magen David, but the fact that David mentions, not just here, but a few other places in the Psalms, that God was his shield. So this intrinsically connects David to the concept of a shield, but here it's symbolic. And so when the sages later were developing the blessings to be said after reading the Haftarah, so one of them is Baruch Atah Hashem Magen David. Blessed are you, God, the shield of David. And so this goes back 2,000 years. For those who happen to have my book, Secrets of the Magen David, where I go through the whole history of how this symbol became the primary symbol of Judaism today, that many of the historians, it goes right over their heads, this association of the shield with David in these Psalms, in the blessing of the Haftarah. That's a different subject, but it's important to point out that here, 3 different times, David associates God as his shield. Then we're jumping to the 11th verse, and it says here, it's actually the 10th verse. It says, V'yirkav al kruv v'ye'of, that God was riding on a keruv. A keruv is a type of angel. And for those who follow our Tuesday class on Maaseh Merkavah, it just happens that this week is half of the class is going to be about this type of angel called a keruv. But here, David is mentioning that God is riding, as it were, on this angel. And this is the idea of riding upon. This is the idea of a Merkavah. He's riding on the keruv. So this is one of the ideas that we've been developing in the Tuesday class, that the idea of Maaseh Merkavah, the workings of the chariot, go much farther back in history than just the vision of Ezekiel. That it's a tradition that goes actually way before Ezekiel. So that's an important thing. Then we're going to the 25th verse. And for the next 3 or 4 verses, I'm going to read this. It says, therefore, God recompenses me according to my righteousness, according to my cleanness in his eyesight. With the merciful, thou will show yourself to be merciful, and with the upright, you will show yourself to be upright. And then he says, and with the perverse, you will show yourself as, here is translated as subtle. In other words, what David is saying is, according to a person's deeds, that is how God is going to treat the person. And this is a subject that we've gone over countless times, called a measure for a measure, mida keneged mida. And here David is acknowledging this kind of dynamic. If a person is righteous in their deeds, then God will act towards this person with righteousness. If the person is merciful, God will act in mercy. Now, this is one of the major teachings of the Baal Shem Tov. And he learns it from one of the Shir HaMalot, one of the Psalms, the 121st Psalm, where it says, Hashem tzilcha al yad yaminecha. Hashem is your shadow on your right side. And so the simple understanding is almost like David is saying about God being a shield, that God is a shadow. He's protecting a person. He's by a person's right side. The Baal Shem Tov explains it in a certain way much deeper. And he explains like this. Why does it use the metaphor of a shadow? So the Baal Shem Tov says a shadow mimics the action of a person. A person lifts his hand, the shadow lifts its hand. A person jumps up and down, the shadow jumps up and down. And so the Baal Shem Tov said, really exactly what David is saying here, is that God is the shadow on your right hand, meaning the way that you act, God will mirror that. He's your shadow. And so here, very interesting, we see that David is expressing the same idea in different words than the source that the Baal Shem Tov used from one of the Psalms, which actually David wrote. So that makes it a very clear reference. There are certain Psalms, really the vast majority, that we know that David did write. And so that's just a very, very beautiful connection between the Baal Shem Tov and David HaMelech. According to Hasidic tradition, the Baal Shem Tov is the incarnation of the nefesh of David HaMelech, the lower level of soul of David HaMelech. Then in the 33rd or the 32nd verse. It says, Mi tsur miladei Elokeinu. Who is the rock other than our God? Here, David is referring to God as a rock. Now, it's not the usual way that we refer to God, but in Hanukkah, I think everyone knows the song, Ma'oz Tsur Yeshuati, that God is referred to as the rock. In English, it's called Rock of Ages. And what's interesting is that when the founding people of the state of Israel, when they declared independence, so they didn't write a constitution. Israel to this day still technically does not have a constitution. But in the Declaration of Independence, at that point, the secular component of the Zionist movement was in great measure secular. There were, of course, religious, but they were in a fairly small minority. And so when they were trying to write the words of the Declaration of Independence, so the question was, would God be mentioned or not? And there was actually quite a big debate. And in the end, the only reference to God is Tsur Yisrael, the rock of Israel. They didn't use God's name or any other more obvious reference to God, but they did use the rock of Israel. And here we see David HaMelech, 3,000 years ago, is also referring to God as Sur. Now, this is one of the things that we're going to pick up more next week. But in the 46th verse, it says, Chai Hashem ubaruch tsuri. Here, it's literally God lives, and blessed is my rock. Again, tsuri. Again, David refers to God as his rock, his support. So what's interesting is, and like I said, we're going to explore this more next week, that one of the Zmirot that we sing on Shabbat, or some people sing on Shabbat, one of the songs, has this line in it. It's taken right from this song. Chai Hashem ubaruch tsuri. It's part of the song. Next week, we're going to go much deeper into the influence of David on all of Jewish history. And then at the very end of the song, it says like this, Migdol Yeshuot Malko, V'oseh Chesed L'Mishicho, L'David U'Lezaro Ad Olam. That's how the song ends, where it says that God is a tower of salvation, is David's king, and he does loving kindness to his anointed one, which is David himself, to David and to his seed, his lineage, forever. That's how it ends. Now, for those who are familiar, in the grace after meals, when we bench after eating bread, this line is included towards the end of benching. Every time we make a blessing after eating bread at a meal, we say this line, and this is actually the last line of the song. Now, what's interesting is here we have what's called a ketiv and a kri. that sometimes a word is written in a certain way, but there's a rabbinic tradition that we actually say it differently, slightly differently. This is one of the cases where it's written magdil, but we say it migdol. And the reason that it's important is because of this, anyone who opens up the Grace After Meals will see that during the week, the sages wanted to take this idea of the way it's written and the way it's read and make a division between what we say when we're blessing for bread after a meal on Shabbat, or if it's during the week. So during the week, we say Magdil Yeshuot. But on Shabbat, we say Migdol. And that is really right from the source right here. Interesting enough, in Psalm 18, one of the differences, and there are only a few slight differences, there that you don't have the way it's written and you read it, just says Migdol Yeshuot Malko. Only the way that we say it on Shabbat. Now, what's interesting is one of the 10 archetypal songs that we mentioned is the song of Hannah. And one of the verses in Hannah says, Vayiten oz lemalko, v'yorem keren mishicho, that God gives strength to his king, and he lifts up the horn of his anointed one. What's interesting is, of course, Hannah is the mother of Shmuel. Shmuel is the one who first anoints King David as king in secret. But here, the last line of the song is, in a certain way, mirrors this verse from Hannah. It's very, very similar. Very, very similar. Again, David says, Migdol Yeshua Malko, V'yoseh Chesed L'Mishicho, L'David L'Zaro Ad Olam. And Hannah says, Vayiten Oz L'Malko, V'yoram Keren L'Mishicho. So that's just a beautiful connection, connecting Hannah, Shmuel, and David. And that's the end of chapter 22. Moving on to chapter 23. So here we know now this is getting towards the end of David's life. Because it says, the Eila Divrei David ha'achronim. These are the last words of David. Obviously not literally. I should mention, we're going to finish one way or another Shmuel Bet tonight. But the story of David doesn't end with Shmuel Bet. At the beginning of the book of Kings, David is quite literally on his deathbed. And so the beginning of the book of Kings, David is still alive. We're going to get to that. But he passes away very shortly after that. So here where it says, these are the last words of David. And it says, Naum David ben Yishai, Naum HaGever Hukam Al, Mashiach Elokai Yaakov, Unaim Zimirot Yisrael. These are the last words of David, the son of Yishai, and the words of the man who is able to rise above, the anointed of the God of Yaakov, the sweet singer of Israel. Now this phrase, Unaim Zimirot Yisrael, is one of the phrases that is used to describe David, the sweet singer of Israel. And this is what we're going to discuss next week. That David was a warrior, he was a king, he was a leader, but he was also a poet and the sweet singer of Israel. So that we're going to get to more. But here he describes himself as the one who is able to rise above. And when we look at the whole life of David, which we've been following for many months right now, and God willing, next week, where we try to put all of the pieces together, we'll see when David says about himself that he's a person who's able to rise above. His whole life was full of really challenge, conflict, and he is the epitome of a Baal Tshuva, of one who does tshuva. He was able to rise above even his own mistakes, even his own sins, and he was able to rise above. And here it says, Ruach Hashem diber bi, umilato al shoni. He says, the Spirit of God spoke to me, and his words were on my lips. So this is a very, very important verse that David is writing about himself. And according to tradition, David is considered both a prophet and one with Ruach HaKodesh, with what's called divine inspiration. The Arizal said the greatest of the prophets, of course, is Moshe. But he said the greatest of all those who had Ruach HaKodesh was David HaMelech. And the Psalms is the testimony to the divine inspiration of David. And here he's saying clearly that God spoke to him, and the words of God were on his lips. And here, his last words are fairly short, but he repeats I would call it almost the most important theme running through all of the Psalms, is that basically what he's saying is that how God was always with him, always protecting him, and that the good in this world will be rewarded and the evil will be defeated. This is a theme that runs through all of the Psalms, this idea of good and evil, and that ultimately God will help, assist, protect those who are on the side of good, and those on the side of evil will ultimately be paid back. And then we go into a very long section in chapter 23, which reviews the names of David's warriors. We're not going to go into this in great detail, but it names all of them. Some of them, it tells different stories about their, we'll call it their prowess, their strength, their gutsiness, and their warrior-like natures. And these are the main people who went to war with David all the years. This was his core warrior group. And they're divided into, he has his top three, and each one of them did incredible things. We know, like, for example, one of them, it's attributed to them that single-handedly he killed 800 enemies. Well, this gets close to Samson. Shimshon killed 1,000 single-handedly. So that just shows you like the kind of people that we're talking about here. And then it tells an interesting story, and it really shows the kind of loyalty that David commanded among his closest people. If we go back to the beginning of when David is being chased by Shaul, and originally 400 men join him, and then later they say it was 600. But this was his core group for his whole life. And people, I think it was last week, we discussed the relationship between Yoav, his general, and David. Very, very complicated relationship. But Yoav, for all of the things that he might not have done correctly, showed incredible loyalty to David. And so here it goes through and it names them. But one of the stories is that one time David said that he longed to drink water from the well of Beit Lechem. And at that point, Beit Lechem was either surrounded or taken over by the Philistines. But he was just saying, oh, would it be that I could drink water from the well of Beit Lechem, of Bethlehem. And so what happened is 3 of these warriors, at great risk to their lives, snuck behind enemy lines and quite literally went to the well in Beit Lechem and brought back water for David. They totally risked their lives. And when they brought back the water and they told him the story, we went behind enemy lines and we got you water because we know that you wanted it. And so David actually takes the water and he spills it. He says, God forbid that I should drink this water that you risked your lives for. In other words, I was expressing a longing. I had no expectation. I didn't want anyone to risk their life to try to get me this water. And what he did is he one second. And it just says that he poured it out to God. In other words, he must have said, God, this water is for you. And he wasn't putting down these people, but he was just saying, I don't feel right about drinking this water that you risked your life for. Let's dedicate it to God. Now, one of the warriors that will be mentioned in the book of Kings, because he became one of the important advisors of Shlomo Melech, the son of David, was Benyahu ben Yehoyada. And here he's called Ben Ish Chai, the son of a living person. Here again, we have what's called a Ketiv and a Kri. It's actually written Ben Ish Chayil, a son of a mighty man, of a man of valor, like we say on Shabbat for a woman, Eshet Chayil. Here it's called Ish Chayil, a man of valor, but we read it Ben Ish Chai, a man, the son of a living man. Now, there's 2 connections here. Is one of the greatest, just about 100 years ago, one of the greatest Sephardi rabbis in Baghdad. He was known as the Ben Ish Chai after this person here. And he wrote many Sfarim, and to this day, he's considered one of the great Sephardi rabbis of the last, let's say, 500 years. But what's interesting here is, according to tradition, he wasn't alive at this time. He's called, Ben Yahu is called the son of Yehoiada ben Ishchai, but he wasn't alive. And so based on this, the sages say that tzaddikim, righteous people in their death, are called alive, and evil people, while they're alive, are called dead. They're called dead. And so this is where it comes from. Ben Ish Chai, the son of a living man. And that's why the Zohar says that when a tzaddik leaves this world, his influence doubles, becomes even greater, because now this person is not bound by the laws of nature, by physicality, and the soul's influence can be even spread even farther. And we see this just in, let's say, the last 200 years. We see, I'm just picking out three people. One is the Lubavitcher Rebbe, that in the 30 years, it's 31 years that, no, it's 30 years since he passed away. The Chabad movement has virtually tripled in size. I believe when he passed away, there were 1,000 Chabad institutions around the world. I think there's about 3,000 now. So that's one example, that his influence has spread tremendously. Another one was Rebbe Nachman of Breslov. When he passed away, first of all, he was very controversial. And at his height, they say he had maybe 1,000 followers. Core group, much less than that. But 1,000 people who were in the bigger circle of people influenced by Rebbe Nachman. Last year, or the previous year, the last 2 years, because of COVID and then the war in Ukraine, it's become very difficult for people to get to Rebbe Nachman's grave on Rosh Hashanah, which is the classic time to try to be at the grave of Rebbe Nachman, is on Rosh Hashanah. But at its height, there were 30 or 40,000 people every year on Rosh Hashanah in Uman. And those are just people who can make it to Uman. So here we see how his influence has spread. And the other one is Shlomo Carlebach, that his type of praying, his davening, Carlebach minions, literally all over the world. There's nowhere you can go anymore that don't have Carlebach minions. Or even if they're not an official Carlebach minion, who don't use his nigunim in their way that they pray. So these are just three examples. Ben Ish Chai. At the end of chapter 23, so very interesting, it says that one of them was Uriah the Hittite. If you remember, Uriah was the husband of Bathsheba. This is the one that David sent to the front lines to try to hide the fact that Bathsheba was pregnant from David. We're not going to go back into that story. We spent lots of time on that story. But here it's just interesting that he wasn't just any soldier. He was one of David's top warriors. At the end, it says 37 in all. So there were if you go back over the whole chapter, it mentions 37, but actually it doesn't mention 37. Here it says 37 in all, but there's only 36 mentioned. So there's many different commentaries of how you could figure out the difference between 36 and 37. The explanation that I heard was that David, he was the 37th. He didn't include himself, but he was the greatest warrior of them all. He was the leader. He led them into battle, according to tradition, 18 times. David fought 18 different wars. If that sounds like a lot, if you just think about it, if you count the wars from the beginning of the state of Israel, there are numerous wars. Just since approximately 2005, we have fought 6 or 7 wars just in Gaza. So David fought, over these 40 years, fought 18 different wars, not little battles, whole war, and he was successful. And that's why the kingdom that he gives over to Shlomo was the largest kingdom in Jewish history. It was enormous. Now we come to chapter 24, which is the last chapter of Shmuel Bet. And I have to admit, this is a very difficult chapter to understand, philosophically, and even just to understand the simple storyline of what's happening. I'll go over the simple storyline, and we'll mention a little bit the complication here. So what happens is David, first it begins and says that the anger of God burned against Israel, and he incited David against them, saying, "Go number Israel and Yehuda." So this is very perplexing because it sounds like God is angry at Israel. It doesn't say why. God is angry at Israel, and the word is he incites, he puts it into, the only way we can understand really, he just puts it into David's mind to do something that will be a reason to punish Israel. And so what is it? To go and do a census, to number Israel. But again, the verse sounds like it's God's idea. Now, this reminds us of Parshat Lech Lecha, when Moshe sends 12 spies to spy out the land in preparation for Israel to go into the land and conquer it. And we know the story that 10 of them came back with an evil report. And because of that, they were spying for 40 days. God said, a year for a day, a year for a day. So we ended up 40 years in the desert. But there it begins, Shlach lecha anashim. You read the simple way we translate it is God is telling him to send spies. And yet Rashi tells us, the tradition is, God says to Moshe, I'm not commanding you to send spies. If you want to send spies, send spies. I'm thinking of that because here it begins by saying that God is angry at Israel, and he incites David to do something that in the end will turn out as a way to punish Israel. So, but then as the story continues, it sounds like it was totally David's idea to do a census. So he calls Yoav and he says, go and count Israel. What he really wants to know is, again, this is after 18 wars. He wants to know how many people, men between 20 and 60, are there for the armed forces. And Yoav says to him, again, this is part of the complicated relationship between Yoav and David. Yoav here very respectfully says, why do you need to do this? We have a tradition. We don't just count people for no reason. You don't really need to do this. And David commands Yoav to go do the census, and Yoav does. And it takes him 9 months, approximately 9 months. It says he went from Dan to Beersheba. He went all over Israel, and he did what David had said. The Midrash says, when Yoav comes, it says, respectfully, I don't advise you to do this. So David said to him, are you king or am I king? Am I the general or are you the general? Meaning, I'm the king, you're the general, I'm telling you what to do. And Yoav goes and he does it. And when he comes back, he has the count. And then it says that David's heart like hurt him that he had numbered the people. And David said to God, I have sinned greatly in that which I have done. And now, God, please forgive your servant, for I have done foolishly. So this certainly sounds like David is taking responsibility, that he realizes, maybe I shouldn't have done this. Some say in principle, there was nothing wrong with David doing a count. But some say he didn't do it in the right way. That we have a tradition that we don't count people directly. In the Torah, they did it by a person giving a half shekel. That's how they would do a census. And here it says that David figured he could count the people, and later they would deal with the half shekel. And that is what David isn't saying I did completely wrong by counting the people, but it's explained that he feels that he didn't do it in the right way. Yoav was telling him, you only count people when you have to. You don't have to count the people. So David might have felt that the whole census was unnecessary, but he only came to this conclusion afterwards. And then God comes to the prophet who is called Gad, G-A-D, not G-O-D, saying, and this is where it gets very complicated. He says, God says to him, go to David and tell him, I'm going to give you 3 choices. 1, I can bring a famine for 7 years upon the land, or you can be chased by your enemies for 3 months, or I can bring a pestilence upon the land for 3 days. You choose one, and that's what I'll do. This is what God says that the prophet should tell David. And so many explanations how David is trying to figure out, like, which one should I choose? And like, what's the reasons for this? It's very, very unclear why these 3 possible punishments were chosen, what they had to do with the census altogether, because 2 of them technically had nothing to do with David. A pestilence and a famine would be against the people. And so only the middle one was about David. And David understood what he was being told is there was a reason that the people were about to be punished, but maybe if he took it upon himself, then it would alleviate having it to happen. And then it continues, it never says, and David chose the pestilence. But the next thing it says, there was a pestilence. And we're told that it wasn't even for 3 days. It was, which is 72 hours. It was substantially less time. But it says that 70,000 people died in this pestilence. And then David sees an angel hovering over Yerushalayim. And David is afraid that all of Yerushalayim is going to be wiped out. And so here, David says to God, he says, God, I have sinned. I have done wrong. But what have the people done? Why are they all dying? He says, let your hand be on me and against my father's house. So here it's like I said in the beginning, it's very hard to understand what is really happening here. Again, this whole story starts where it says God was very angry at the people. A number of the commentaries say here that, first of all, here David is rising to the level like Moshe. After the golden calf, God says to Moshe, please move out of my way, and I will destroy the people, and I will make a new people out of you. A very, very interesting offer here. Moshe can be the new Avram Avinu. The whole people will come from him. And of course, we know that Moshe says, I won't move out of your way. And if you do such a thing, wipe me out of your book. I'll have nothing to do with this. And so the commentaries say here, David is in a certain way rising to the same level, because he keeps on saying, I have sinned, but there's something else happening here. And so what is explained to try to understand this, because it's not easy to understand, is that what God was angry with was there were 2 rebellions against David. David is the chosen of God. He is the anointed of God. We heard tonight that David calls himself the anointed of God. And here there were 2 rebellions, and a good part of the people joined these rebellions against David. So it was as if they were rebelling against God. And that's how it's explained here. Even though David is in a certain way trying to take everything upon himself, it's said that it's really because of what the people did. And so what happens after David says, take it out on me, don't take it out on the people. So then God came to God, and God came to God, to the prophet God, and told David, go and build an altar in the threshing floor of Aravna, the Yebusite. Now this is a turning point in Jewish history. What is going on here? David had conquered Yerushalayim, but when we say Yerushalayim, the city of David was below what is presently called the old city of Jerusalem. It's farther down. And the Temple Mount, that was the threshing floor of Aravna. It wasn't in David's hands at that point. And that is the Temple Mount. So after this whole strange occurrence, David is commanded to go and build an altar in the place that will be the future temple. And if you remember, it was David's idea in the first place to build a temple to God. And God said to him, because you had this idea, the kingship will never leave your family, but you have too much blood on your hands, and therefore only your son will be the one to build it. But many times the temple is called after David because it was his idea. But here he's told to go build an altar to God on the Temple Mount. So he goes to Aravna and he asks permission. He wants to buy the threshing floor. Aravna, who has been living in peace with David, says, by all means, make yourself an altar. I'll even give you animals to sacrifice. And the book ends where David insists that he buys the threshing floor of Aravna. And so that's how it ends. And David built there an altar to God and offered offerings and peace offerings. So God was entreated for the land, and the plague was stayed from Israel. That's how the book ends. So here we see really an archetypal idea here. And I'm going to mention this not in any way to justify, because when we talk about the Holocaust, we can't really get our head around it and justify it. The Lubavitcher Rebbe was very, very strong against those who proposed ideas of why the Holocaust happened. He felt it was a divine mystery, and it's not for us to try to come up with it happened because of this, it happened because of that. And so here we see only 3 years after the Holocaust, the state of Israel is born. So here, after this plague that takes 70,000 lives, here, right afterwards, God is instructing David to build an altar on the Temple Mount. This is one of the last deeds that David does. And what's interesting to point out is there are 3 places in the land of Israel that we bought with money. The first was Avram bought the Marat Machpelah, the burial place for Sarah in Hebron. Yaakov buys the section of Shechem where he lived after he came back to Israel, and David buys the Temple Mount. So all 3 of these places are 3 of the most contested places in the world, especially for the Jewish people: the Temple Mount, Hebron, and Shechem. All 3 of them are dafka the ones that we actually made a kinyan on. We took possession legally through a purchase, and yet these are the 3 of the places that are the most contested. But here we see that right after this, in a certain way, mysterious pestilence, then the story changes completely. And here is the establishment of the Temple Mount, which will be where the temples are built, and God willing, the third temple. And so with this, we end the second book of Shmuel. I hope everyone will come next week, or those who don't watch this live, make sure to follow as we begin trying to now look at the whole life of David and understanding the deeper understanding of David HaMelech. Welcome everyone to Insights into the weekly Haftorah. This week is the fourth of the 7 Haftorahs of consolation. As we mentioned, they all come from the book of Isaiah. This week's parsha is Shoftim, and the Haftorah comes from the 51st chapter of Isaiah, starting with the 12th verse, and runs through the 52nd chapter, the 12th verse. This is a fairly long Haftorah. It is totally classic, as we'll see why. How many verses here become important parts of our prayers. Excuse me, I just had to get a text here. Okay, so these are all called Haftorahs of consolation. So it goes without doubt that almost all of this Haftorah in different ways is consolation. Sometimes it mentions how we've been in exile, the kind of oppression that we have experienced. But the theme running through the whole thing is consolation, redemption, and the future messianic era. So here I want to just point out some of the important things that come from this Haftorah. In the class that we just had, for those who were listening or watching, about King David, and we mentioned how many ideas in his Psalms were incorporated in the prayers. In this Haftorah, we see 3 different verses from Lecha Dodi. Lecha Dodi is the one of the most famous songs of all of Jewish prayer that we sing every Kabbalat Shabbat, every Friday night, greeting the Shabbos bride, and written by Shlomo Halevi from Tzfat, a follower of the Ramak. And so here, if we go to verse 17, it says, Hit orori, kumi Yerushalayim. Wake up, get up, Yerushalayim. Yerushalayim was destroyed. And here the consolation is God saying, Yerushalayim, get up, get up. If you go to Lecha Dodi, one of the verses is Hitorari, ki ba'orech kumi ori. Wake up, because your light has come. Wake up, the light. Comes right from this Haftorah. A second one is, it says in the beginning of the 52nd chapter, it says, Uri, Uri, livshi uzech Sion. So again, it's like it's the same root as hitoruri. Get up from the dust. Excuse me. Get up. Clothe yourself in strength, in garments of splendor. So here it says, Kumi tzai mitoch hafecha. Wait 1 second. I'm sorry. Hit nari me'afar kumi. Exactly what it says here. Wake up from and dress yourself. Leave she big day tifartech ami. And dress in clothings of beauty and splendor, my people. Again, right from the verse here. And then it says, Hit na'ari me'afar kumi, Shavi Yerushalayim. Get up from the dust and stand up the exiles of Yerushalayim. And that's again in Lecha Dodi, where it says, Hit na'ari me'afar kumi. So here we see that around a third of all the verses from Lecha Dodi are inspired from the words of Isaiah that are in this Haftorah. Another one that we say all of the time is, especially in benching, and when we say grace after meals, U'bnei Yerushalayim ir hakodesh. So where does that come from? And build Yerushalayim, the holy city. Comes right from this Haftorah, where it's in verse 1 of the 52nd chapter. It says, Yerushalayim ir hakodesh. That's Isaiah is really the first calling Yerushalayim the holy city. So here we see the tremendous influence of Isaiah in general, but specifically in this Haftorah. Another one is that the cardinal prayer of Judaism is the Amidah. We pray it 3 times a day, on holidays and Shabbat 4 times, the Amidah. And before the Amidah, we end the previous section by saying, Baruch atah Hashem, Ga'al Yisrael. Blessed are you, God, who has redeemed Israel. And here it says, Ga'al Yerushalayim. Here, Isaiah is saying that God is the one who redeems Yerushalayim. One of the blessings in the Amidah is for God to rebuild the city of Yerushalayim. And one of the blessings is also Goel Yisrael. But here, Isaiah says, Ga'al Yerushalayim. So this is one of the sources of this blessing before the Amidah. If we go back, Isaiah talks about the terrible oppression that the Jewish people experienced while in exile. And it says that a time is coming that will be full of God's fury and the rebuke of God. And then it says, therefore, listen now to this, O afflicted one, drunk, but not with wine. Behold, I have taken from your hand the cup of stupefaction, and the cup of my fury. No longer shall you drink from it again, but I will put it into the hand of your tormentors. So here the image is God is taking this cup of fury that the Jewish people experienced, and now he's going to take it and put it in the hands of those who oppressed us. The reason I'm mentioning this is if we remember at the Seder of Pesach, when we get to saying the 10 plagues, and there are two different traditions. As we say each plague, we either pour out a little wine 10 times, or we put our finger in the wine and we take a drop out of the cup. There's two opposite explanations for this. One is, even though the plagues were needed to free Israel from bondage, nonetheless, the Egyptians are also made in the image of God. They're human beings. And they just like we suffered under the Egyptians, now the Egyptians were suffering through the plagues. So we take out a drop of wine to acknowledge that their suffering makes it that our cup isn't full. That's one explanation. There's another explanation that is exactly the opposite, and it comes from right here, where that we say, when we take out a drop, and we say that this drop is literally just a drop from the cup of God's fury that in the end of days will be directed towards those who tormented, exactly what Isaiah says here, who tormented the Jewish people throughout history. So here again, you have the source. And one last one is in the 7th verse of the 52nd chapter. It says, Ma navu al haharim raglei mivaser, mashmiya shalom mivaser tov, mashmiya Yeshua. So it says, how beautiful ascending the mountains are the footsteps of the herald who is saying peace, heralding good, making heard salvation upon Zion. So on Hoshana Rabbah is the last day of Pesach, of Sukkot. And the prayers of Hoshana Rabbah are unique in the whole year. They put together the way that we chant the prayers of Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. Instead of just making one hakafa, one circuit around the synagogue with our arba meaning, the 4 species, we make 7 Hoshana Rabbah. It's the 7th day of Sukkah. And there's very long prayers, very, very impactful, forceful. Towards the end, we put down our 4 meaning, and we pick up 5 willow branches. And we hold these 5 willow branches, and the last prayer is based on this verse that I just read. How beautiful ascending the mountains are the footsteps of the herald, making heard peace, heralding good, making heard salvation. And that's in English, but in Hebrew, it is kol mivaser v'yomer. A voice speaks out. It speaks out and it says. And then there's for me, it's one of the most beautiful, powerful, potent prayers of the whole year. It is totally messianic, and it's all about Mashiach coming. But you keep on repeating, Kol mevaser mevaser v'yomer. A voice is announcing, it is saying. And then at the end, we actually, the whole congregation yells it out together 3 times, Kol mevaser mevaser v'yomer. And it's like the story of Mashiach coming. It's like virtual reality. When you're in the midst of this prayer, it's like happening. And it comes right from this Haftorah. So what we can learn here is we see that 3 of the verses of Lecha Dodi come straight from this Haftorah. This final climactic prayer on Hoshana Rabbah comes from this Haftorah. And every time we bench, and in our prayers, we always refer to Yerushalayim as Ir HaKodesh, the holy city, also comes from here. So from this, we can see the tremendous influence of Isaiah on all of Jewish literature after him. The Lecha Dodi was only composed approximately 500 years ago. So that is approximately 2,200 years after Isaiah. His words are still ringing through Jewish tradition. So when we read this week, we should keep this in mind, and we should pray that all of this consolation will truly lead to Mashiach coming.